A voice from the shadows. Welcome to the Ghastly Journal. Welcome to the Ghastly Journal, where we do not shy away from the unspoken, the unsettling, or the unspeakably strange. I'm your host, and if you're new here, you should know we don't just recount history. We excavate its most disturbing corners. We pry open coffins long sealed by time, we read between the faded lines of forgotten records, and we listen closely to the whispers that cling to ruins and relics like cold breath in a crypt. Tonight's tale, dear listener, is not merely another ghost story. This is something else, something that has lingered in the shadows of European folklore for over 2 centuries, yet has never fully faded from view. It concerns a family whose name has become synonymous with dread in certain circles of the occult. A name that, once spoken aloud, seems to hang in the air like a question no one dares to answer: the Halberts. Let me say this clearly: what you're about to hear is not for the faint of heart. This is not the tale of a haunted house or a spectral apparition glimpsed in passing. This is the legacy of a family whose very existence was a defiance of death. A defiance that began in the fog-shrouded highlands of 18th century Scotland, and some say continues to this very day. If you have candles lit, now might be a good time to extinguish them. If you are alone, perhaps double-check that your doors are locked. Because once this story begins, you will not soon forget it. Not when you look out into the dark and wonder if someone or something is still watching. The family who never buried their dead. This is the story of the Halberts, a name once spoken in hushed tones in the parishes and backrooms of Scotland, and now whispered only in the recesses of internet forums and rare manuscripts. The Halberts were not murderers, at least not in the traditional sense. They did not hunt their victims or prowl the night with knives and bloodlust. Their horror was quieter, more methodical. It was a horror of preservation of devotion, warped into obsession of refusing to let go long after the soul had flown. They were quite simply a family who never buried their dead, but that statement, stark as it is, fails to capture the true depth of what they became. This is not merely a story of corpses kept past their time. It is a story of tradition, hardened into doctrine of science, twisted by grief, and of a patriarch who believed that death was not an end, but a negotiable boundary. As with many tales that straddle the line between documented fact and macabre legend, the Halbert story begins innocuously enough. Just another family fleeing scandal, seeking quiet anonymity in a remote village. But what they brought with them was far from ordinary. A set of beliefs that would curdle into ritual. A practice that would eventually blur the line between life and death so thoroughly that even their own children could no longer tell the difference. This tale is stitched together from historical records, first-hand accounts, journal entries, and perhaps most disturbingly recovered artifacts that should never have seen the light of day. It will take us from windswept hills to hidden laboratories, from decaying manors to forgotten cemeteries, and perhaps even into the present day. If you are still with me, then we begin. A cold beginning in Blackmore. Our descent into darkness begins in the late 1700s in the remote Scottish Highlands, where the village of Blackmore lies nestled between craggy mountains and dense whispering forests. It was here that Magnus Halbert, his wife Elelana, and their 3 children, William, Charlotte, and young Thomas, settled after fleeing Edinburgh under circumstances that remain murky to this day. What is known and what survives in fragmentary municipal records is that Magnus had once been a promising natural philosopher, a term we now associate with early scientists who had fallen from grace. Whispers of unapproved anatomical studies and forbidden experimentation dogged his reputation. It is said that he had attempted to cross thresholds man was never meant to traverse. When a prominent member of Edinburgh's medical guild died under suspicious circumstances, the Halberts vanished overnight. Their destination, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of Blackmoor perched atop a steep ridge and known locally as Ravencrest Manor. The house built of cold grey stone with narrow windows like watchful eyes loomed over the village below, like a silent guardian or a lurking threat. From the beginning, the Halberts kept to themselves. They hired no local staff, despite the estate's size. Elalana was rarely seen, and the children were schooled at home. The villagers, already steeped in superstition, found the family strange, but chose not to interfere. After all, they brought no trouble, at least not at first. And in places like Blackmoor, where the wind carries voices and shadows stretch unnaturally long, it is often safer to mind one's own business. But even then, something about the Halberts felt off, as if they belonged to an older time, or perhaps a different order of being altogether. What drove them from Edinburgh? The unspoken past. The full truth of what transpired in Edinburgh may never be known. But like all legends rooted in historical soil, the story leaves behind scraps, letters, rumors, fragments of disciplinary records and witness accounts that point to something dark slithering beneath the surface of Magnus Halbert's early career. Some claim he was expelled from the university after performing unauthorized vivisections in the dead of night, dissecting cadavers in ways that suggested not mere curiosity, but an intent to repair the body reverse what time and decay had done. Others believe he'd been experimenting with chemical compounds, mixing preservative agents with biological matter in ways that baffled even his peers. One particularly persistent rumor states that Magnus had been caught attempting to reanimate the corpse of a stillborn child, claiming he had developed a serum capable of restoring breath to the lungs and warmth to the skin. Whatever the exact details, it was enough to render him persona non grata. The medical council reportedly struck his name from its ledgers without ceremony, and the Halberts' townhouse was found abandoned one foggy morning, their belongings gone and their name whispered only in disapproval. From there, their trail goes cold until it resurfaces in Blackmoor, hundreds of miles away, and a world apart in terms of belief and scrutiny. Blackmoor, with its mist-wrapped hills and deep-rooted fear of the unnatural, was the perfect place to disappear. And Magnus knew that. He didn't come to this village seeking redemption. He came seeking freedom, the kind of freedom only isolation can provide. And in that isolation, something began to fester. The house above, Ravencrest Manor. Ravencrest Manor was unlike anything the villagers of Blackmoor had seen. Constructed long before Magnus's arrival, it had stood empty for decades, its previous occupants having left under equally murky circumstances, though the locals rarely spoke of them. The manor itself was a stern Gothic relic, jagged rooflines, gabled windows, iron weather vanes that shrieked when the wind turned sharp. Its walls were built of dark volcanic stone hauled from the mountains by long-forgotten laborers. Even in daylight, Ravencrest looked cloaked in shadow, and at night, when the oil lamps flickered behind its narrow windows, the house seemed to brood to watch. It wasn't long before the villagers began referring to it only in whispers, as if saying its name aloud might summon something unspeakable. The Halberts settled into the house with unsettling ease. They brought crates of books and glass canisters, trunks of preserved herbs, cases of surgical instruments and peculiar mechanical devices whose purposes no one could guess. The townsfolk noticed that none of the local tradespeople were invited to assist with renovations. No one was ever seen entering the house apart from the family themselves. And despite its distance from the village center, the sounds of hammering and dragging, sometimes even faint music, would drift down the hill long after midnight. Magnus was seen on rare occasions, stiff-backed and expressionless, purchasing supplies with exact change and speaking only when necessary. He looked less like a man starting anew and more like one carrying a heavy secret uphill and burying it beneath stone. A family apart, the Halberts, among the villagers. As the seasons passed, the villagers grew increasingly wary of the Halberts. It wasn't merely that they kept to themselves, it was how thoroughly they did so. They didn't attend church, a decision that bordered on scandalous in Blackmore's devout community. Elelana was never seen at market, nor were the children ever spotted playing in the fields or woods. Even their dogs, large black beasts, said to have followed them from Edinburgh, roamed the grounds without collars barking, only when someone ventured too near the manor fence. It was as if the family had wrapped themselves in a cocoon of silence and ritual, refusing to acknowledge the rhythms of village life. There were other signs. No smoke rose from Ravencrest's chimney for weeks at a time, then would suddenly belch out foul-smelling plumes that stung the eyes. Some villagers claimed to see strange blue light flickering in the attic windows, an eerie artificial glow. On one memorable occasion, a group of curious children dared each other to sneak onto the property. They returned within minutes, pale and silent, refusing to say what they'd seen. All they would repeat was that the house wasn't asleep. Over time, the Halberts stopped being a subject of gossip and became a subject of fear. The older villagers invoked old superstitions, speaking of thin places where the world grows weak and something older creeps in. The Halberts, it was said, had brought such a thing with them. Something that did not sleep, did not rot, and most disturbingly, did not leave. A fever that changed everything. The winter of 1798 arrived early in Blackmore, bringing with it a biting frost and a sense of foreboding that settled over the village like a shroud. It was during this season, under heavy skies and howling winds, the tragedy, or perhaps the beginning of something far worse, struck the Halbert household. Elelana, the matriarch, fell ill. Villagers later said they saw no smoke rise from Ravencrest for days, even as temperatures plummeted. Then one morning, a rider was sent into the village with a note written in a rigid, slanted hand, physician required at once. M.H. Dr. Isaac Sullivan. Blackmore's only medical professional responded as duty compelled him, though he admitted privately to his wife that he feared what he might find at the manor. The house greeted him with its usual oppressive silence. Magnus himself answered the door, pale and cold-eyed, offering no greeting, only a command to follow. The doctor was led up a spiral staircase into a high chamber where Elelana lay unmoving beneath a velvet coverlet. Her skin was waxy, her breath absent, her eyes half-lidded and dry. Sullivan, trained though he was, could barely suppress his unease. After a few moments of examination, he confirmed the obvious: Elelana was dead. "I'm sorry, Mr. Halbert," He began gently reaching for his satchel, but Magnus interrupted, his voice clipped and unyielding. "There will be no burial. My wife stays here. She stays with us." Sullivan, stunned, protested, citing both law and decency. But Magnus stood firm, and something in his gaze told the doctor that he would not be moved. Sullivan left that night under falling snow, heart pounding, not entirely certain he had treated a grieving man, or something else entirely. A dinner guest from beyond the grave. Dr. Sullivan, disturbed by the encounter, returned the next day with Reverend Clark, the parish's spiritual leader. The Reverend, a stern man himself, but not lacking in compassion, hoped to reason with Magnus, if not as a physician of the soul, then at least as a fellow man who understood the weight of grief. But when they arrived at Ravencrest, something felt immediately wrong. The iron gate, usually shut, stood slightly ajar. The house was silent. No servant answered their knocks, though no servant ever had. At last, the door creaked open just enough to reveal the dim hallway beyond, and Magnus's voice echoed from somewhere deeper within. "You are not welcome, Reverend. The family is not receiving guests." Still, Clark stepped forward, and what he saw beyond that crack in the door would become the defining horror of his life. In the dining room beyond the shadows sat Elalana Halbert. Dressed in a pale gown, her hair neatly arranged, she sat propped in a high-backed chair at the head of the table. Around her, the family sat in silence, as if partaking in a quiet meal. None of them spoke. None of them moved. It was as though a portrait had come to life, or worse, a scene had frozen in time just before it turned grotesque. Reverend Clark gasped, and when he demanded an explanation, Magnus responded with a chilling calm. "She remains with us. Death does not break the bond of family. Her soul is near, and to bury her would be to sever that tether forever." Clark fled the manor that evening, white with fear. From the pulpit the next Sunday he preached of sin and unnatural defiance, but he never again visited Ravencrest. Nor did he utter the Halbert name again, even on his deathbed. Fear takes root in Blackmoor. Word spread quickly through Blackmoor. Though few had seen what Reverend Clark and Dr. Sullivan had witnessed, the mere outline of the story was enough to set the village ablaze with speculation and dread. A dead wife seated at her own dining table. A family refusing to bury their dead. It was an affront not only to religious sensibilities, but to something deeper, older, a primal instinct that the dead must be laid to rest. Those who had once shrugged off the Halberts' strangeness now crossed the street to avoid even the mention of their name. Mothers held their children closer. Windows were shuttered at dusk. Some villagers whispered of demons or witches. Others believed Magnus had uncovered some lost pagan rite, something ancient and terrible that granted him power over death, but demanded a steep and ongoing cost. Sheriff Douglas Mercer, an aging but respected figure in the county, felt compelled to act. He made his way to Ravencrest on a gray afternoon, determined to investigate. Magnus met him at the door and surprisingly did not resist the inquiry. Instead, he handed Mercer a collection of parchment scrolls, crumbling yellowed inked in a language the sheriff could not decipher. "This is our family covenant," Magnus said, his tone almost reverent. "It dates back generations. We have always kept our dead with us. It is our way." Mercer, though unnerved, could find no law explicitly forbidding the practice. As long as there was no sign of foul play and no evident health hazard, there was nothing to charge Magnus with. But as he rode back to the village, The sheriff could not shake the feeling that he had just looked into a darkness that neither law nor logic could penetrate. He would never return to Ravencrest, not even years later, when far worse things would come to light. A house of the living dead. What followed over the next few months would transform the rumors surrounding the Halberts into something more than idle village gossip. It would become law. A handful of tradesmen who were permitted into Ravencrest to deliver supplies returned shaken pale and oddly reluctant to speak. But under drink or duress, some of their accounts leaked into Blackmore's collective imagination. They spoke of Elelana, the dead matron seen not just at the dining table, but elsewhere throughout the manor. In one instance, a mason delivering bricks claimed to glimpse her seated by the fireplace, an unfinished embroidery ring resting in her hands. Another reported that she was standing at the piano, her gloved fingers splayed across the keys as if caught mid-hymn. No smell of rot followed her, no signs of physical decay. Instead, they said she looked paused, as though life had left her, reluctantly and only just. It was not just Elelana who unnerved these visitors. It was the family's response to her. Magnus referred to her in the present tense, speaking of her likes and dislikes, her thoughts on the weather, or what she might wear if they were to receive guests. The children were no different. William, now 16, reportedly bowed his head when passing her in the hall as if she were still matriarch of the household. Charlotte once told a visitor that her mother had praised her sewing. Little Thomas asked when she would read him his favorite story again. One tradesman remarked in hushed horror that the family had come to believe, or had forced themselves to believe, that she had simply grown silent. Not gone, not dead, just still. And in this stillness they welcomed her continued presence as if nothing had changed. For the people of Blackmore it was not just unnatural, it was profane. Belief hardened into ritual. But perhaps the most disturbing element was not the preservation of Elelana's corpse. It was the ritualization of her presence. Over time, her position changed. She appeared in different rooms at different times of day, as though following a schedule. At dusk, she could be seen through the upstairs window, seated in what locals dubbed the morning room, her outline framed against the curtains like a spectre watching the village below. At dawn, she sometimes sat in the garden, her sun hat pinned carefully beneath her chin despite the bitter cold. Some claimed to hear piano music drifting through the trees, not a recording but played live. By whom, no one could say. Magnus, increasingly reclusive, no longer interacted with villagers at all. Instead, he sent Charlotte, now 13, and visibly strained by the family's burden to collect necessities. She never smiled, never spoke unless spoken to, and always returned to the manor before sundown. Her eyes, witnesses noted, looked hollow. Not in the poetic sense, but as though she had seen too much and had nowhere to put it. Thomas, too young to comprehend death in its finality, clung to a fragile illusion, repeatedly telling townspeople, "Mother is resting. She will get better soon." The horror lay not in violence, but in this slow erosion of reality. The Halberts weren't hiding from grief. They were rewriting it, reshaping death into something else entirely. And that made them all the more terrifying. Because while grief is universal denial, this deep becomes ritual, and ritual has a way of summoning things that were never meant to return. A macabre legacy takes root. By the end of 1799, Ravencrest had become more than just a home to the Halberts. It had become a mausoleum disguised as a household, a living museum of denial and necromantic reverence. Word of the family's unholy practice had spread beyond Blackmore. Strangers, writers, occultists, even a handful of mystics began arriving quietly in the village, asking questions, hoping to catch a glimpse of the living widow of Ravencrest. Some left shaken, others never left at all. One man, a London scholar named J. Whittington Brown, was said to have spent 3 nights at the manor. When he returned to his inn, he refused to speak a word. He left the next morning paid in full and burned every journal page he had written during his visit. There are truths he was overheard muttering that unravel the mind like thread from an old coat. Meanwhile, the Halberts continued to exist in their carefully controlled nightmare. The villagers, though horrified, remained paralyzed, torn between outrage and fear. Some lobbied the local authorities to intervene, but without evidence of crime or disease, no one was willing to challenge the powerful, almost mythic aura that now surrounded the Halberts. Death had come to Ravencrest, but it had not left. It had made a home there, wearing the gowns of a mother, reading books with a boy sipping imagined tea from chipped porcelain cups. And if Magnus Halbert had his way, death would never leave again. He had turned his family into a sanctum, a shrine, a growing archive of still-beating grief suspended between the tick of a clock and the silence that follows when time forgets to continue. What began with a fever was now something else entirely. Something permanent, a second death, and the tableau expands. It was the autumn of 1800 when the Halberts experienced their second tragedy. Unlike Elelana's drawn-out decline, this death came suddenly and without warning. William Halbert, the eldest child, now 17, had taken to exploring the dense woods beyond Ravencrest's southern ridge. He was often seen alone, stalking through the pine-shadowed thickets, with a rifle slung over his shoulder and a leather-bound field journal in his satchel. The villagers noted that he no longer spoke when he passed them on the road, if he acknowledged them at all. He had inherited his father's stiff posture, his mother's silence, and something else, a distant fixed gaze, as though he were already peering into a world beyond this one. One misty morning, a single shot echoed across the forested hills. It was not followed by birdsong, not by rustling leaves, just silence so deep it seemed to settle into the bones of Blackmore. Hours later, William's body was discovered by his younger sister Charlotte, slumped against a tree, the hunting rifle still gripped loosely in his lifeless hands. The barrel was scorched. Powder residue laced his gloves. The verdict was obvious, a misfire at close range. The bullet had torn through his ribs and collapsed a lung. By the time Charlotte found him, it was already too late. But as always in this tale, death was not an ending. It was merely the beginning of a new role in the Halbert household's performance of the macabre. William's body was carried back to Ravencrest in the dead of night by his father and siblings. No announcement of death was made. No priest was called. No burial was scheduled. And soon Ravencrest welcomed another resident who would never leave. Preserved, positioned, and present visitors, few as they were soon reported sightings of William inside the manor. He now sat in his favorite armchair in the vast Ravencrest library, his back rigid, his face expressionless but intact. A book rested open in his lap as if mid-paragraph. A reading lamp stood beside him, always turned on during dusk hours, casting a golden glow on a figure who no longer turned pages. Some claimed the position of the book changed periodically. One village boy who snuck up to a window on a dare said he saw the book fall from William's lap, and that when he returned the next night, it was back in place, held again by stiff, unmoving fingers. More troubling still were the whispers of preservation. Magnus had long spoken in abstract terms about the body as a vessel and the soul as a lingering spark. But with William something more deliberate had occurred. His skin did not sag, his eyes, though lifeless, did not cloud, and his flesh bore none of the signs of decay. It was as if time itself had been halted, paused like a tableau for an eternal observer. Magnus never explained how this was achieved, but in his study, locked behind iron doors, the glow of unfamiliar machinery and the scent of acrid chemicals told their own story. Charlotte and Thomas adjusted quickly, at least on the surface. Charlotte took to reading aloud in the library, sometimes seated across from her brother's unmoving body. She rarely looked directly at him, as if afraid her gaze might break the illusion. Thomas, only 9, occasionally left small toys at his brother's feet, whispering secrets or jokes he still thought William could hear. In this house, the dead did not leave. They lingered, participated, endured. They became part of the family in ways no living soul could fully understand or escape. The village grows. Quiet. By now the village of Blackmoor no longer whispered about the Halberts. It feared them, not in the way one fears a predator or an angry god, but with a reverent dread reserved for things that defy categorization. Ravencrest had become a place outside the rhythm of normal life. It did not breathe with the seasons. It did not change with the years. It stood still, an edifice of denial and defiance, a monument to grief made ritual. While most villagers crossed themselves when they passed the gates, a strange few began moving in the opposite direction. Drawn by morbid curiosity or some darker longing, these seekers found themselves captivated by Magnus Halbert's rumored knowledge. Some came with questions about resurrection. Others sought to learn the secrets of his embalming techniques. A few claimed to sense a presence when they neared the manor, as if the dead within were aware of them watching from behind shuttered windows. This strange interest from outsiders birthed something new, a cult of curiosity. Rumors spread that Magnus had deciphered something lost to time, an ancient formula, a forgotten rite, a chemical communion between body and soul. Books on esoteric preservation, banned anatomical studies, and necromantic texts began disappearing from nearby libraries. A black market trade in alchemical supplies started to thrive in towns far beyond Blackmoor. And through it all, Magnus said nothing. He never addressed the attention. He never gave lectures or wrote treatises. He simply continued his work unmoved, unreachable, unknowable. The villagers, for their part, began to avoid the manor altogether, not out of superstition, but survival. Blackmoor had always been a place of fog and quiet, but now its silence had grown deeper, darker, filled with the kind of stillness that warns you something is listening, something that does not blink, something that remembers. Ritual and revelation, lights in the night. It was in the years following William's death that Ravencrest's transformation from reclusive estate to whispered holy site of the macabre became undeniable. The manor, once merely strange, now radiated a different kind of presence, unnatural and quietly terrifying. Villagers began reporting strange lights emanating from the windows during hours no family ought to be awake. Blue and green pulses flickered behind the attic shutters. Once, a passing shepherd swore he saw firelight flaring from a chimney that hadn't produced smoke in years, only for the flame to suddenly vanish, leaving no ash, no soot, no warmth. More disturbing still were the sounds. On nights when the moon was full and the air hung still, a low, rhythmic chant could be heard drifting down from the estate. Not Latin, not Gaelic, but something else older. Some described it as a hum layered with whispered syllables, the cadence hypnotic as if the voices were summoning something rather than mourning. One villager claimed that during a sleepless night she heard a piano playing each note strikingly precise, though the melody was discordant, like a song played backward or inside out. Shepherds who tended their flocks near the Halbert property began moving their animals to new pastures. One man, grizzled and long past the age of ghost stories, reported seeing figures moving among the hedgerows at dusk. Not walking, he said, but remembering how to walk. Their joints moved stiffly mechanically like puppets whose strings had been tied wrong. It wasn't just the dead that the Halberts kept, it was movement itself. Simulated life in place of actual death. As the months passed, Ravencrest ceased being a house of mourning and became a theater of denial with Magnus as both director and priest, the emergence of believers. Despite, or perhaps because of the growing horror surrounding the Halberts, they began to attract followers. A strange circle of outsiders, drifters, and quietly desperate villagers began forming a loose orbit around Ravencrest. At first, they came under the guise of tradesmen, repair workers, or researchers, but they stayed too long, asked too few questions, and returned to the village with eyes that no longer seemed entirely present. These weren't mere curiosity seekers. They were believers. The cult of Magnus Halbert was never formalized. There were no temples, no printed doctrines. But those who visited Ravencrest regularly began to echo his philosophies that death was merely a threshold, that the soul lingered near the body, that with the right knowledge one could restore the connection. Some took to wearing gloves at all times, even in summer, as if hiding the first signs of decay. Others avoided mirrors, claiming reflections gave too much away. One even requested to be buried with a syringe filled with a preservative fluid just in case. Village authorities took notice, but there was little they could do. No laws had been broken, at least none that could be proven. The strange new visitors paid their dues at the inn kept to themselves and disappeared after a few nights, never returning, but always replaced by others. It was as though something at Ravencrest had begun to call people, and like moths to a decaying flame, they came and they left. Changed. Emily Sutton and the Threshold. Of all those drawn to Ravencrest during this period, the most significant was a young widow named Emily Sutton. She had arrived in Blackmoor after the death of her husband, to consumption, a grief-stricken woman looking not for hope but for explanation. She had heard of Magnus Halbert and the rumors surrounding his work. The idea that anyone might understand how to maintain a connection beyond death was enough to draw her up the winding path to the manor. She brought with her a small locket containing a strand of her husband's hair, a bundle of funeral cloth, and a question she could not voice aloud. What she found at Ravencrest was not what she expected. In her personal journals, later recovered under mysterious circumstances, she described the manor as a home where time had stopped in deference to grief. The deceased were present in the most literal sense. Eleanor sat in the conservatory with her needlework. William lounged eternally absorbed in a novel he would never finish. Magnus spoke to them, set places for them at meals, nodded in their direction during conversation, as though they might interject at any moment. The children, Charlotte and Thomas, carried out their days as if nothing was wrong, except of course everything was. Emily wrote of Magnus as magnetic and terrifying, a man whose charisma masked a relentless fixation. He spoke of death as a door, not locked, not sealed, but ajar just barely. He believed, she wrote, that with the right tools and timing one could push that door open again, or worse, pull something back through it. Emily was not just intrigued. She was captivated, and before long she was staying at Ravencrest far longer than any guest had before. Her descent into the world of the Halberts had begun, and the consequences would be irreversible. The laboratory of the dead Emily Sutton's transformation from visitor to disciple began the moment Magnus unlocked the east wing of Ravencrest and invited her into the space no outsider had ever seen. The laboratory. That word does not do it justice. It was, as Emily later described, a sanctum of the unnatural where the rules of rot were bent until they begged for mercy. Glass tubes coiled like serpents along the walls. Steel tables glinted beneath flickering gas lamps. Cabinets lined with jars of reagents gave off a sharp, acidic stench that clung to Emily's skin for days. Notes were everywhere, pinned to cork boards, scrawled across parchments, even etched directly into the stone walls with chalk and blood. In this strange sanctum, Magnus laid bare his vision to preserve the body not merely in form, but in function. He believed the soul lingered near the corpse for days, weeks, perhaps years, bound by emotional resonance and interrupted biological flow. He spoke of soul static, an energy that could be measured, amplified, harnessed. His journals contained diagrams of nervous systems preserved in silver nitrate hearts, immersed in formalin that still quivered under certain frequencies, tongues sutured to the roof of mouths in an effort to retain memory. The goal was not just to stop decay. It was to prevent departure. Emily, at first repelled, found herself slowly pulled in. Grief dulled her revulsion. Curiosity ignited something colder. She began assisting Magnus with minor tasks, logging notes, maintaining temperature controls, labeling chemicals. Over time, she began conducting small experiments of her own. She preserved a bird that had died at her window. She collected hair from her late husband's brush and attempted to reanimate its follicle cells. "It's like holding the breath of God," she wrote, "and waiting to see if it exhales." Children of the Threshold. The most haunting aspect of Emily's time at Ravencrest was not the science, it was the children. Charlotte, now 14, had grown into a quiet, almost ethereal presence. She read aloud to her mother's corpse, adjusted her shawl with the precision of a nurse tending to a sleeping patient. Emily wrote that Charlotte never spoke of death, only of stillness. She treats the line between alive and gone. Emily noted, as though it were merely a matter of timing. Thomas, meanwhile, had begun to withdraw. His questions had stopped. He no longer asked when his mother would wake up. Instead, he played games in silence, always near William's chair, often positioning wooden figurines to face the preserved corpse, as though waiting for approval. Emily came to realize the children were not simply being indoctrinated, they had no other frame of reference. Their mother had died before Thomas could form complete memories of her. William's death was followed by his visible, ongoing presence in the home. The Halbert children had grown up in a world where death was not departure, but adaptation, where grief was not processed but curated. More unsettling were the moments Emily caught Magnus watching the children not with affection but with calculation. He monitored them the way a scientist observes a trial. Once late at night, Emily overheard him speaking to Charlotte through the door. "You're starting to slip," he said softly. "Don't let the cold in. Don't think of leaving." That same week, Charlotte began wearing gloves at all times, even while reading. Emily asked why. Charlotte only said, "My fingers stiffen in the mornings. Father says it's normal." The door swings both ways. By the spring of 1802, Emily's journal entries had grown increasingly erratic. Gone were the objective observations. In their place were cryptic phrases, "The threshold is thin tonight. He speaks with the dead when the storm breaks." Charlotte's reflection doesn't match her movements. She began referring to the laboratory as the chapel. Her handwriting degraded slanting, sharply margins, shrinking as if the words were trying to escape the page. She wrote of rituals Magnus had developed, chemical, spiritual, perhaps both. Preservatives injected with a formula of embalming fluid deer marrow and something she could never identify. Magnus had created a calendar of Tether's dates when the veil between life and death was supposedly weakest. On these nights, the family gathered not in mourning, but in communion. Emily witnessed one such gathering. William's body was seated upright, hands clasped in prayer. Eleanor was positioned at the head of the table. Magnus lit 3 candles of different heights and recited a chant in a tongue Emily had never heard. As the flame danced, she swore she saw Eleanor blink. Whether hallucination, hysteria, or truth, Emily could no longer tell. Her final journal from that spring contained only one line repeated 7 times. "Death is not behind us, it's beside us, always watching." The winter of isolation. In the winter of 1803, Blackmore was smothered by one of the harshest seasons in living memory. The roads disappeared beneath feet of snow, and heavy clouds dulled the sun for weeks at a time. Crops had failed in the autumn, and stores ran low. The village, already haunted by the brooding presence of Ravencrest, became more inward, more silent. It was during this time, amid hunger and fear, that something unspeakable occurred. 3 children vanished. They had been playing on the outskirts of the village just before a blizzard swept down from the northern pass. When they failed to return, search parties were formed, lanterns bobbing through the gloom like will-o'-the-wisps. For days, nothing was found. No footprints, no torn clothing, no trace at all. Then came the rumor. A hunter cutting through the woods near Ravencrest swore he saw movement on the estate grounds, figures in the snow that did not move like people. They were too stiff, too slow. The hunter described them as children, but not quite. Their limbs jerked, their heads turned too slowly, and they walked barefoot through the frost without leaving tracks. The search was redoubled. Sheriff Mercer, who had not dared return to Ravencrest since his unsettling visit years before, now found himself with no choice. He gathered a group of 6 armed men and rode to the manor in the heart of the storm. What they found would sear itself into the town's memory for generations. The iron door. Behind Ravencrest, concealed among the pines and nearly hidden beneath snow, they discovered a new structure, one no villager remembered being there. It was a squat, windowless building of pale stone crowned with a rusting iron chimney. A single thick door blocked entry. The structure was featureless, except for a symbol carved into the lintel, an unfamiliar glyph that none of the men recognized, though one swore it resembled an eye with a needle through it. From inside came an odor that made several of the men gag sickly sweet chemical, and under it all something ancient and wrong. A faint sound could be heard, as well a wet, mechanical rhythm, something between a heartbeat and a ticking clock. When Magnus refused them entry, citing delicate work in progress, the sheriff gave the order. They broke the door open with iron tools and axes. It took 3 men and 20 minutes. What they found inside silenced them. The room was colder than the outside air, lined with metal tables and surgical tools. On each slab lay a body, or something approximating one. Stitching ran from shoulder to hip, mismatched limbs, torsos, far too small or grotesquely elongated. Some bore the faces of children, others composite masks built from multiple visages, and worst of all, some of them moved. Not freely, but in pulses. One body jerked its leg upward every 15 seconds like a machine attempting to walk. Another's fingers twitched endlessly, as if trying to grip a missing hand. In the far corner, partially hidden beneath a blood-stained tarp, were the unmistakable remains of the missing children. Arrest and exposure. Magnus Halbert was arrested without resistance. He watched the proceedings calmly, hands folded as if merely observing a failed experiment. Emily Sutton was found inside the manor, nearly unrecognizable, her face smudged with soot and embalming fluid. She did not speak. Her eyes were glassy and unfocused, as if staring beyond the veil she had once tried so desperately to cross. Charlotte and Thomas were discovered huddled in a corner bedroom, their cheeks sunken, their lips cracked, their bodies weak from starvation. Neither child would speak for days. When they did, their words were fragmented, filled with contradictions and confusion. Charlotte insisted that her mother had been trying to teach her sewing again. Thomas cried for William, asking why he wouldn't get up from his chair. The search of Ravencrest revealed more horrors. In addition to the preserved bodies of Elelana and William, authorities uncovered the remains of at least 7 other individuals hidden throughout the manor, some behind false walls, others seated among furniture, as if frozen in the middle of daily life. Each was preserved with alarming skill, their faces waxen but intact. In Magnus's laboratory, investigators discovered dozens of journals, diagrams, anatomical sketches, and formulae. His final entries detailed an experiment he called reversible passage. He believed he had isolated the moment just before the soul's full departure from the body. If he could stop time chemically, spiritually, he might reverse the process entirely. He wrote one phrase again and again in the margins of his final journal, "The door swings both ways," the vanishing from custody. The trial of Magnus Halbert and Emily Sutton was brief, shockingly brief, in fact. Given the gruesome discoveries at Ravencrest and the undeniable presence of multiple preserved corpses within the manor, the authorities expected a public spectacle, but that never materialized. For reasons never fully explained, the proceedings were held in private, far from the county courthouse, under the pretense of sensitive evidence and community safety. Witnesses were not called. The journals found at the estate were sealed away by the Crown's internal office. Magnus and Emily were found guilty, but no detailed charges were released. Only one line appeared in the final docket: unlawful practices of anatomical preservation and acts against natural order. They were sentenced to hang, but the execution never took place. The night before their sentence was to be carried out, something occurred that would send a final tremor through the already terrified village of Blackmore. When the guards came to retrieve the prisoners from their cells, they found the iron doors locked. Still latched from the outside, the keys had not been removed. The hallway remained quiet, no signs of tampering, no broken locks or bent bars, and yet the cells were empty. There was no hole in the wall, no hidden passage, no footprints on the damp floor. The prisoners and everything they had with them were gone. Just gone. The last procession. 3 days later, just before dawn, a shepherd by the name of Arthur Kells was tending to his flock in the moorlands east of Blackmore when he noticed movement along the ridge. He watched, confused, as 5 silhouettes passed through the mist with slow, synchronized steps. At first he thought it might be a traveling family displaced by the storm. But then the stillness struck him. They didn't sway with their steps. Their arms didn't swing naturally. Their movement was mechanical, like a marionette operated by a novice hand. He crouched low and watched. The figures resolved themselves slightly through the shifting mist, a tall man in a dark coat, a woman beside him with long, motionless hair that didn't move in the wind. 2 children walked hand in hand behind them, one of them shorter, almost dragging a foot behind him. The 5th figure was harder to place. A teenage boy, perhaps. His head tilted slightly to the side as if listening for something. But none of them looked at each other. None of them spoke. They moved in perfect silent unison. Kells stayed frozen in the grass until they disappeared over the hill. When he finally stood, the air felt colder, emptier, as if something sacred had just been violated by their presence. That was the last confirmed sighting of the Halbert family in Blackmore, the decay of Ravencrest. After their disappearance, Ravencrest Manor was declared condemned. No one stepped foot on the property again, not willingly. Local magistrates attempted to sell the land, but every transaction fell through. Buyers withdrew without explanation. One surveyor sent to reassess the estate reportedly left Blackmore mid-assignment and never returned. Over time, the house fell into ruin, reclaimed by moss and wind and the inevitable erosion of memory. But the bones of it remained, its spine of stone still jutting against the sky like a warning. Children dared each other to approach it to touch its broken gates or peek into the shattered windows. But they never stayed long. Those who did return came back quiet, changed. They spoke of strange shapes in the corners of empty rooms of cold air that breathed back of a piano that played when no one touched its keys. They said they saw faces in the glass, unmoving, pale and watching. The name Ravencrest faded from legal maps, but not from local memory. For generations, Blackmore passed down stories of the house and the family that lived within it. Not buried, not gone, just waiting. The sightings in France. In 1837, over 30 years after the disappearance of the Halberts from Blackmore, a physician named Dr. Lucien Béraud recorded a curious case in the village of Saint-Aubin, northern France. His journal, now housed in a university archive in Lyon, describes being summoned to a manor on the outskirts of town, newly purchased by a reclusive family who had arrived just weeks prior. The patriarch, a severe man with rigid posture and a halting French accent, claimed his elderly mother had fallen ill. Upon arrival, Béraud noted the woman lying motionless in bed, skin pale and taut pulse, absent eyes open but glazed. When he gently explained that the woman had passed, the family reacted not with grief, but with irritation. "She is in a deep rest," the patriarch insisted. "We do not disturb her transitions." The rest of the family, 2 children, a teenage boy, and a woman presumed to be the wife, stood silently by their expressions, vacant, their movements unsettlingly slow. Dr. Barraud later wrote, "They moved as if their joints were no longer hinges but strings pulled from memory. Not living, not yet dead." The next day Barraud returned with a magistrate. The manor was empty. The family had vanished overnight, leaving no belongings, only the scent of formaldehyde and a wooden crate filled with glass eyes, each mounted on tiny brass stands like specimens. The authorities searched the nearby woods but found no trace. Local legend quickly dubbed them Les Familles Figées, the frozen family. It wouldn't be the last time that nickname followed them across the continent. Echoes in Germany, Austria, and beyond. By the mid-19th century, sightings of a strange, seemingly ageless family with rigid movements and macabre domestic rituals began appearing in scattered reports across Europe. In 1852, an innkeeper in Bavaria claimed that a family of 5 arrived during a thunderstorm speaking in stiff, archaic German. They requested a room with no windows and carried with them a wooden box that emitted a sour chemical odor. The next morning they were gone. The beds unslept in, but the sheets bore oily residues and blackened stains that would not wash out. In Vienna, 1861, a young embalmer's apprentice quit his position after assisting in the preparation of a corpse at the request of a family identifying themselves as the Halberts. The apprentice claimed the body, a teenage boy, was already perfectly preserved with no signs of rigor mortis. But the family insisted on additional injections, speaking of slowing the separation. The boy's limbs twitched during the process, though the family dismissed it as normal. The apprentice left the city 2 weeks later and reportedly never spoke again. The final known account from this period came from Romania in 1873, where a monastery in the Carpathian Mountains offered refuge to a family of 5, who arrived barefoot in the snow, carrying with them a single bound trunk and an ornate sealed jar. The monks took them in out of Christian duty, but grew alarmed when none of the family members ever joined communal meals. One novice claimed to see them seated together in their cell each evening, speaking to one another in whispers, but none of their mouth moved. They were gone by spring. The photograph. In 1923, nearly a century after the last confirmed sighting of the Halberts in mainland Europe, workers renovating a crumbling tenement house in Prague uncovered something buried within a sealed wall cavity, a bundle of aged documents, and a single black and white photograph. The image, faded and curled at the corners, depicted 5 individuals standing in a garden. A tall man, a woman with her hands folded and eyes that seemed too round, a boy with sunken cheeks, a girl clinging to her side, and a teenager who seemed to be leaning slightly wrong. At first glance, the photographs seemed like any other from the early 20th century. But upon closer analysis, forensic archivists noted disturbing irregularities. The skin of the subjects had a waxy sheen. Their posture was unnaturally straight despite the uneven ground. And most alarming, the woman's eyes bore no visible pupils. Experts suggested the photograph, though developed using mid-century techniques, had likely been staged decades earlier. The paper was consistent with samples from the 1880s, yet the development chemicals left behind on the glass frame were modern. Among the documents discovered with the image were scientific notes written in archaic English describing techniques of tissue suspension, enzyme freezing, and biospiritual anchoring. The author was unnamed, but several pages bore the initials M.H. The photograph and papers vanished from public record shortly after being acquired by a private collector. Their current whereabouts remain unknown. The journal that crossed the sea. For decades, the Halberts remained a European ghost story, part folklore, part occult obsession. But in 2005, a fragment of new evidence surfaced that reframed everything. A seller on an obscure antiquarian website briefly listed a battered, leather-bound journal for sale. The listing disappeared within hours, but not before one user downloaded the single attached image. The page, written in elegant Victorian script, was signed Charlotte H., dated 1847, nearly half a century after the family's disappearance from Blackmore. In the fragment, Charlotte describes preparing for yet another relocation. Father says we must move again. She wrote, the neighbors have begun to ask questions about Mother. She references William's erratic movements, the declining efficacy of the new formula, and her growing fear of her father's obsession. But what struck readers most was the final line, tomorrow we leave for America. Father believes there is more room there to continue the work, to preserve our family legacy. This single page, authenticated by paper and ink experts as mid-19th century, expanded the scope of the Halbert legend dramatically. It suggested not only their survival, but a deliberate migration to the New World. A family seeking space, seclusion, a country still being carved from wilderness where records were sparse and law even sparser. And with that, historians and horror seekers alike turned their gaze across the Atlantic. The Halford Mine, Colorado, 1870. In the high mountains of Colorado, in the mining boomtown of Calaveras, Gulch, local newspaper archives from 1870 describe a family named Halford who purchased an abandoned silver mine and the surrounding property. The family, 2 adults, 2 children, and a teenage boy, was noted for their strange appearance and reclusive nature. They hired laborers only briefly and only for work deep within the mine's sealed shafts. The miners were paid in gold but forbidden from speaking of what they saw. One man, however, returned to town early, pale and shaking, and told the barkeep that what he'd seen inside was a workshop of the dead. He claimed to have witnessed bodies standing in glass tubes preserved in liquid the color of mercury. Some looked fresh, others like wax effigies dressed in Sunday clothes, but one, he swore, turned its head as he passed, following him with eyes that did not blink. "They ain't dead," he mumbled, "but they sure as hell ain't alive." A group of men returned to the site 2 days later, but the property had been abandoned. A fire had been set inside the mine, whether accidental or not, no one could say. But the deepest tunnels were blackened, and all that remained was a broken slab etched with 5 initials, M.H., E.H., W.H., C.H., T.H. Nothing else was ever found. Whispered names in Appalachia. From there the trail grows murky but not cold. In the mountains of West Virginia in the 1890s, oral folklore began to mention a reclusive family known only as the Stiff Ones. Locals told stories of seeing them walking at dusk, their movements slow and synchronized, their clothes always several decades out of date. Children were warned not to approach their cabin where a dim yellow light was said to burn through the night. The family never attended church, never appeared in town, and their presence was confirmed only through sightings from afar. One elderly woman interviewed by a local folklorist in the 1940s recalled passing their property as a girl and seeing a lady sitting on the porch who didn't blink once, not for the whole time we rode past. I stared and stared. Not once. Another tale passed down in the oral traditions of Clay County spoke of the boy who never aged, said to have been seen in the woods for over 30 years, always with the same slouch, same coat, same glassy stare. Local death records contain no family under the name Halbert, Halford, or anything similar. But land registries show a small homestead purchased in 1865 by an M.H. Edwards, a name that does not appear in any census tax or burial record from that region. The property was left abandoned by 1903. But according to nearby townsfolk, the light in the attic never went out. The fire in Maine. In the winter of 2010, firefighters responded to a blaze at a remote farmhouse outside the town of Cold Hollow, Maine. The house stood at the edge of an overgrown property, miles from the nearest neighbor, with no visible path in or out, save for a dirt track nearly erased by decades of neglect. The fire had already consumed most of the structure by the time emergency responders arrived. The heat was intense. The flames unnaturally quiet. It was as though the house had decided to vanish in silence. But it was the basement unearthed beneath the blackened remains of the living room that transformed the event from a local tragedy into a modern mystery. Hidden beneath a false floor, rescuers found a stone stairwell leading to a cold, windowless cellar. Inside were rows of figures. At first they were mistaken for mannequins, perhaps the remains of an artist or collector. But forensic analysis quickly revealed the truth. These were human bodies preserved in varying states, positioned in seated chairs, propped near bookshelves, even arranged around a long, narrow dining table. Some wore suits or dresses from the early 20th century. Others appeared freshly dressed in flannel and denim. Most horrifying of all, some of the bodies had been preserved while still alive, between life and death. Investigators from the State Medical Examiner's Office reported signs of advanced preservation methods techniques far beyond standard embalming. Muscular rigidity had been induced chemically. Blood had been replaced with a thick, translucent gel. Enzymatic decay had been halted, but the bodies retained subtle signs of biological function, capillary response in some fingertips, minor electrical activity in the ocular nerves, and in 2 cases, tooth enamel erosion consistent with recent diet. It was as if these people had been paused, not killed. DNA testing failed. The cellular structures of the victims had been chemically altered, scrambled by whatever compounds had been used to halt decomposition, but more troubling still was what wasn't found. There were no records of anyone living in the house. The deed had been purchased in 1990 by a shell corporation. Utility bills were paid in cash. Deliveries were rare and untraceable. No license plates, no mail, no official photographs. Only one clue surfaced: a partial family tree scorched at the edges, scrawled in careful calligraphy. Near the top, Magnus Halbert. Beneath him, Eleanor William Charlotte Thomas, and 5 empty lines waiting to be filled. The watchers in the window neighbors, if they could be called that, offered little. A few recalled seeing lights on upstairs at odd hours. One woman, a retired postal worker, said she once delivered a misdirected package and caught sight of the family through a cracked curtain: a tall man, a woman with long pale hair, 2 figures sitting side by side at a table, and a boy watching from the stairs. "They didn't move," she said. "Not when I knocked. not when I walked away. It was like they were waiting or listening. No one was ever identified among the remains. No trace of the living residents was ever found, and the cellar, scorched though it was, remained colder than the ground above it. For days after the fire, a temperature drop no equipment could explain. All evidence, including the bodies, was quietly transferred to a federal facility. The report was buried. The official cause of the fire was listed as electrical fault. The public was told nothing, but local legend returned with force. They say that if you drive past the charred ruins of the farmhouse on a foggy night, you can still see 5 silhouettes standing at the edge of the tree line, watching, still, silent, waiting to be invited in. A legacy unburied. What began as a single family's refusal to bury their dead has metastasized across continents, across centuries. From the hills of Scotland to the mountains of Transylvania, from forgotten villages to scorched American soil, the Halberts, or whatever they've become, continue to cast a long, unnatural shadow. Whether as participants in a grotesque experiment or architects of something even more sinister, they've left behind no graves, no tombstones, no final resting place. Only echoes, preserved flesh, and silence. Perhaps the most terrifying truth is not that they survived, it's that they adapted, changed names, changed countries, altered the formula, and in doing so they ensured the continuity of their twisted legacy not through lineage, but through ritual. Preservation as inheritance, denial as doctrine, death not as an end, but as a pause. And as we turn now to part 4, we must ask ourselves, what happens when others begin to follow their example? What happens when imitation becomes evolution, and what horrors await in the places where the Halberts were never known? But their methods were quietly adopted, the doctrine without a name. By the turn of the 20th century, the Halberts had already slipped into the territory of whispered legend. Most historians dismissed their story as rural hysteria or cleverly embellished folklore, the kind of tale that thrived in isolated communities with too little sunlight and too many winters. But beneath the layers of hearsay and journalistic mockery, something older had begun to stir the replication of their ideas. Quietly, obscurely, without attribution. These were not families named Halbert. They bore no traceable lineage to Ravencrest, but they operated from the same blueprint. Somewhere across forgotten towns and cold corners of Europe, individuals were beginning to experiment with preservation, not for medicine, not for burial, but for continued cohabitation. The dead were not mourned. They were maintained, cleaned, moved, and spoken to. The philosophy had no name, but its components were disturbingly consistent. The soul remains tethered to the body after death. With proper ritual, the tether can be maintained. To bury the dead is an act of violence, a severance of the spirit. Family unity transcends mortality. In dusty basements, candlelit barns, and forest-shrouded retreats, those who had read fragments of Magnus Halbert's journals or heard rumors passed like a virus began building their own sanctuaries of the dead. The chapel in the cellar, Belgium, 1911. In 1911, a series of child disappearances in the Flemish countryside led authorities to investigate an aging abbey that had long since fallen out of use. Inside, they discovered a locked trapdoor leading to a stone cellar. What they found would shock even the most seasoned gendarmes, a makeshift chapel lit by gas lamps and populated entirely by seated corpses, dressed in faded church robes and arranged in solemn rows. At the front of the room stood a preserved priest, arms open in benediction, eyes wide and glassy. A pipe system fed into his back, attached to a pressure tank still hissing with chemical residue. Analysis revealed a mixture of glycerin ethanol and a rare resin used in Victorian taxidermy. The only living occupant, a man named Lambert de Heer, claimed he had been preserving the congregation for their return. His writings revealed he had studied texts attributed to M.H., copies smuggled from a burned-down farmhouse in the Americas. De Heer was never convicted. Declared mentally unfit, he was institutionalized in Bruges. His final diary entry read, "I do not keep them for me. I keep them so they will not be forgotten. As long as they are here, I am not alone." The Nameless Commune, Ukraine, 1938. During Stalin's Great Purge, many records were lost or destroyed, but one NKVD report from 1938 survived in fragments. It details a remote agricultural commune in western Ukraine near the Carpathians, where agents had been sent to arrest a local leader for harboring political dissidents. What they found was stranger. The commune was abandoned, but inside a barn the agents discovered over a dozen bodies seated around a long table. Each corpse had been preserved using rudimentary chemical mixtures and natural resins derived from tree sap. Faces were painted, hair combed. Food had been placed in front of each figure, plates rotted and crawling with flies. One report notes that the bodies were warm to the touch despite the cold. No explanation was offered. Scribbled in the margins of the confiscated documents was a single note in red pencil, likely added by a field officer after the fact. They said they were waiting for the bell, that when it rang, the whole family would stand. The barn was burned, the incident buried, false prophets, and the cult of stillness. By the mid-20th century, the Halbert myth had evolved from rumor into ideology. In rare occult circles, Magnus Halbert was no longer a scientist, nor even a man. He'd become a figure of gnosis, the silent architect, a prophet of the undeath of devotion. Small insular cults began forming around this concept, adopted various names: the still communion, the threshold; keepers, the eternal domestic. They were not mainstream, they did not evangelize. But in scattered regions from Yorkshire to rural Ontario, reports began to surface of isolated families refusing burial rites, speaking of long sleep and suspended time. Some would keep their dead relatives in glass coffins inside their homes. Others arranged skeletal remains into shrines. These were not always fanatics. Some were grieving spouses, parents who couldn't let go. One cult in Minnesota, known as the Quiet House, was exposed in 1974 when a gas leak drew emergency services to a farmhouse containing 4 generations of preserved corpses, posed in family tableau in every room. A preserved baby lay in a crib. An elderly woman was strapped to a rocking chair by silk ribbon. The surviving family members, all mentally sound by legal standards, offered no apology. "They live here," the mother said. "They're just quieter now. Replication without origin." The most disturbing realization that scholars, folklorists, and forensic anthropologists have since made is this: many of these echoes cannot be traced back to one another. They appear spontaneously, independently, as if the philosophy of the Halberts, once a hidden doctrine, has become a meme replicating through grief and desperation. In 1998, an anthropologist studying mourning rituals in post-war Bosnia stumbled upon a rural family who had preserved a brother lost to shelling. He was kept in a refrigerated annex, visited daily, prayed over, and dressed once a week. The family insisted this was not inspired by any Western tradition or religious scripture. "We do it," the matriarch said, "because he listens better now." Was it an isolated cultural response to trauma, or had the shadow of Ravencrest its rituals, its defiance already become global? The doctor who didn't file a report. In 2002, an anonymous letter was delivered to the pathology department of a university hospital in Boston. It was postmarked from Maine, typed on an old ribbon machine, and contained no return address. Inside was a series of photocopied medical records, unfiled case notes, and a brief message scribbled in pen. "They're not dead. I checked twice. I don't know what this is." The records detailed a home visit by a hospice physician to an unlisted residence in a wooded area near the New Hampshire border. The patient, an elderly man in his 90s, was described as motionless, without detectable pulse or breath. However, his pupils reacted to light. Capillary refill occurred within 3 seconds. His skin, though cold, was firm but pliant, more like waxed linen than flesh. The attending physician, baffled, took samples back to the lab. The results came back inconclusive. Cellular death was incomplete. Enzymatic activity remained faint but active. The doctor returned to the home the next morning to request additional tests. The property was gone. Where there had been a house was now an empty clearing. No foundation, no footprint, only an indentation in the grass and a scent like old flowers and cleaning fluid. The letter ended, "I've stopped practicing. I see them in my dreams now. I think one of them blinked. The file no one can delete." Around 2011, a file began circulating on obscure corners of the deep web. It appeared under different names: Halbert.exe, Family7.nk, Silentmeal.mkv, but always with the same contents, a short, corrupted video clip lasting exactly 73 seconds. The video shows what appears to be 8mm home footage filmed from the corner of a modest dining room. 5 figures sit around a table. Their posture is stiff but not frozen. They move but barely. The man at the head of the table, believed to be Magnus, raises a glass but does not drink. A teenage boy opens and closes a book repeatedly. A woman blinks twice slowly. There is no audio. The date embedded in the frame reads March 22nd, 1947. Attempts to trace the video's origin have failed. Those who download it report strange behavior from their devices. Desktop icons disappear and reappear in different positions. Typing lags as if something is watching. Most chilling of all, some users claim the figures in the video change position each time it's played. Some say the boy eventually looks directly into the camera. The file cannot be permanently deleted. Subculture of the still. As the internet matured, it became a place not just of connection, but of quiet obsession. Message boards, image forums, encrypted servers, these became the new seance tables. And in their shadows, a new kind of Halbert cult began to form. They don't call themselves by any official name, but they use phrases like the unwaking, preservation over decay. To be remembered is to remain. In one now defunct Reddit thread, users shared photos of what they called still shrines, arrangements of clothing, prosthetics, and wax heads posed in domestic settings. Some of the shrines included recorded voices, on loop family dinners, reimagined, relived. One user claimed to have preserved his mother using a process found in a family journal passed down from a Scottish ancestor. The post was deleted. The user account removed. Another forum known only through screenshots, Chartres, home is waiting. featured recipes for embalming compounds, instructions for eyelid stitching, and discussions on non-consensual tethers. The last archived post read, "If they were loved, they deserve to stay." Traces in modern medicine. In 2016, a global symposium on ethical cryonics was interrupted when a speaker presented slides showing tissue samples from a preserved corpse recovered during a European police raid. The body was at least 80 years old, but the preservation technique had nothing to do with modern cryogenics or embalming. Instead, it matched almost exactly the methods described in Magnus Halbert's 1799 field journals. What shocked the audience wasn't the technique, it was the results. The body's connective tissue was intact. Cartilage was firm. Neural degradation was minimal. Despite lack of breath or heartbeat, the subject showed residual bioelectrical activity in the cerebellum. In other words, some tiny part of the mind might still have been operating. The sample was confiscated by authorities 2 days later. The symposium's website was taken offline. No further papers on the subject have been published. A lingering family. Even in a digital world saturated with hoaxes, the Halberts remain uncannily consistent. The family of 5. The stiff movements, the glassy eyes, the waxen skin. The insistence that they are not dead, just quiet, and always the presence of a journal, a scrawled record, sometimes recent, sometimes centuries old, always referencing Magnus, always speaking of the work. It's no longer possible to say whether the Halberts themselves still walk the earth, but their image, like a virus, has replicated across cultures, mediums, and minds. They are not merely folklore now. They are an idea that refuses to die. And perhaps that's the most terrifying transformation of all. For it means they no longer need to be present to persist. They just need to be remembered. Across the ocean into silence. If Charlotte Halbert's journal fragment is to be believed, and few who have read it would doubt its authenticity, then sometime around 1847 the Halberts boarded a ship bound for the New World. Charlotte wrote of her father's obsession with vast empty spaces, places where no one would knock on doors or question why curtains stayed drawn. America, then barely a century into its nationhood, offered just that privacy through isolation. No record of their immigration exists under the Halbert name, but passenger manifests from that year list a family of 5 under the alias Halford embarking from Liverpool and disembarking in Boston. From there the trail runs cold, but not long. By the early 1850s, stories began to spread along the Oregon Trail of a strange wagon party that never camped with others, never buried its dead and left no graves behind. Multiple pioneers recounted passing a silent family of 5 with glassy eyes and stiff gaits. One woman swore she saw a boy reading aloud to a man in a chair, despite the man never blinking once. Others spoke of a girl who tended a female figure wrapped in cloth, her lips dry and parted her hands, folded over her lap like porcelain. No one could recall ever seeing them eat. The Halberts had crossed the ocean, but they brought their deathless domesticity with them. The Colorado root cellar. In 1870, in the foothills near Calaveras Gulch, Colorado, a fire broke out at a homestead believed to have been long abandoned. Miners reported smelling a chemical scent before the blaze, like embalming fluid, left too long in the sun. Local sheriff's deputies found a root cellar beneath the ashes. Inside were 3 chairs, one child-sized, arranged around a decaying table. All 3 held preserved human remains, still seated, dressed in mourning garb from a previous century. A rusted tea kettle rested on the stove. The case might have been dismissed as frontier madness if not for the initials carved into a wooden beam, WHRCHTH. One deputy recorded hearing a ticking noise from deeper within the earth behind a bricked-off corridor. It sounded like clockwork lungs, he wrote. The tunnel was collapsed with dynamite by order of the town elders who buried the incident literally and historically. But legends of the T family persist to this day in local ghost stories. Children are still told not to venture into the old mines. You might find a family, the warning goes, and they might not want to be alone anymore. Appalachia's walking dead folks. The Halberts were not the only ones in the New World walking with the dead. In West Virginia, Tennessee, and the deep hollers of Kentucky folk tales from the late 1800s speak of the walking dead folks. Not zombies, not ghosts, but something far more mundane and more terrifying. They were always described the same. A family of 5, silent, pale, dressed in out-of-time clothing, living in an old house with the windows blacked out. They went to town only rarely and only for vinegar, salt, or fabric. One storekeeper claimed the girl asked for needles strong enough to go through old skin. The father was said to be a doctor. The mother never spoke. The children never aged. People in the mountains began leaving bundles of herbs on fence posts to ward off visits. They said the family came at night if they smelled morning in the air. Some homes were found with wax footprints in the mud outside. One man claimed he saw them standing in his barn, just standing for hours before disappearing. To this day, certain hollers in Appalachia are avoided. No maps, no trespassing, and if you knock on the wrong door, they say a little boy might answer, look up at you with dry eyes, and ask if you've come to stay with the family. The swamp rituals of Louisiana. By 1902, tales of the family who stayed together after death had begun to appear in the bayous of southern Louisiana, especially among French-speaking Cajun communities. There, the Halbert legacy took on a folkloric, almost mythic tone. The family was known as Les Endormis, the Sleepers. Locals claimed they lived on a sinking houseboat deep in the cypress swamps. Some nights you could see faint lights flickering across the black water. Others swore you could hear piano music echoing between the trees, though no one owned a piano within 30 miles. Those who encountered them described a dining room set afloat, a raft bearing a table, 5 chairs and 5 still bodies. One hunter shot at the boat in panic. The bullet hit one of the figures, and he claimed the man looked up slowly, then simply leaned back into his chair. Later that year, the hunter went missing. His cabin was found filled with black candles and jars of preserved animal parts. A note on the table read, "They made room for me, the family in the trees." In the Pacific Northwest, where the redwoods loom like time frozen in, wood hikers and forest rangers began reporting strange sightings as early as 1918. The accounts all share a bizarre similarity. A family of 5 dressed in Victorian clothing glimpsed through the trees, never blinking, always still. They are usually seen seated in a circle, sometimes around a fire that never smokes. Other times, simply facing each other in silence as if having a wordless conversation. The strangest account comes from 1921, when a group of loggers stumbled upon a clearing where they found a full dining room set china, silverware, crystal, all arranged on a table beneath the open sky. 5 waxen figures sat motionless in the chairs. The loggers fled. When they returned with others, the table was gone, but the impressions in the ground remained. Today, locals call that place Still Grove. Campers report strange dreams, cold spots, and waking to find their gear rearranged into family-like arrangements, 5 shoes lined up, 5 cups, placed in a circle, 5 sleeping bags, zipped and unmoving. The park rangers don't patrol that section after dusk. The boarding school in Montana. In 1934, officials investigating a failed religious boarding school in the hills outside Fort Benton, Montana, uncovered what they believed to be evidence of ritual neglect. What they found was worse. The school's St. Cyprian's had been shuttered for months. No staff had responded to telegrams. When authorities arrived, they found the chapel cold and abandoned the dining hall fully set but dust-covered. And then came the dormitory. Inside, 12 children were discovered, seated silent, unmoving. They had been dead for weeks, but none were decomposed. Each wore clean uniforms. Their faces were powdered. Their hands were folded in prayer. The headmaster, a man named Francis Harlan, was found seated at his desk, dead by apparent stroke. In his journal, he had written only one entry during the final week of operation. "We follow the family doctrine now. The children will not leave me again." To this day, no one knows how he learned about the doctrine. But in the pages were references to Charlotte and Thomas. And at the back of the journal, pressed flat between 2 pages, was a note written in distinctly feminine handwriting. "We remember you, headmaster, and we welcome you." The Nevada Desert House. In 1959, a military contractor working near a decommissioned test zone west of Tonopah, Nevada, came across a house that didn't appear on any map. It stood alone, immaculate. The lights were on, curtains drawn, a mailbox marked H. Out of curiosity and perhaps guilt over years spent building instruments of death, he knocked. A boy answered the door. He was polite, still, his voice flat but not unpleasant. When asked if his parents were home, he nodded. "They're in the dining room," he said. The man entered. He never spoke of what he saw, not to his wife, not to his priest, but he left the military 2 months later, moved across the country, and was institutionalized within the year. In the final letter he ever wrote, addressed to no one, he scrawled, "She looked at me with glass eyes and asked if I would like to stay for supper. I said yes, but I never sat down. I just backed away and ran, and I think I've been running ever since." The family on the highway. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, truck drivers traveling the old back routes of Route 50, which cuts a quiet, desolate path through Nevada. Utah and Colorado began reporting encounters with a strange station wagon. Always the same description, outdated model, late 40s or early 50s. Pale green paint, no license plate, 5 passengers. A man driving a woman in the passenger seat, 2 children in the back, and a teenage boy pressed against the window. The car never passed, never pulled over, just followed at a steady pace behind them for miles. Then gone. One driver, haunted by the encounter, installed a rear-view camera in his cab. Months later, he caught the vehicle again. In the grainy footage, the passengers were motionless. What disturbed him most was that in one frame, when the headlights bounced off the windshield, the boy's face was pressed flat to the glass, eyes wide, mouth closed, staring. Not at the road, at the camera. The preservation of Loretta Grace. In 1988 in Amity, Arkansas, a young woman named Loretta Grace was laid to rest after dying in childbirth. Her grieving father, a retired mortician, arranged a private ceremony and sealed the coffin himself. The burial took place. No questions were asked. 3 years later, a power outage during a thunderstorm caused workers to stumble upon a sealed shed on the family's property. Inside was Loretta's preserved body seated in a rocking chair. A decaying infant doll was swaddled in her arms. Both had been injected with industrial-grade fixatives, their skin coated in wax and blush. Taped to the back of the chair was a yellowing page torn from a hymnal on which was scrawled, "I do not lose family. I do not bury. I do not forget." The father was never charged. In his defense, he said, "She told me to wait. She said the Halberts would come. America's shadowed inheritance." By the time the 21st century dawned, the Halberts were no longer just a family. They were an archetype, a presence, a set of behaviors and signs that repeated themselves not through bloodlines, but through grief, isolation, and obsession. Their story had seeped into the marrow of rural America. Invisible churches, unnamed communes, the quiet house on the edge of town where no one ever leaves. You don't need to say their name. You just need to live like they did. No burials, no goodbyes. Just chairs around a table always waiting to be filled. And if you see 5 figures watching from a window, still silent eyes, glinting like polished glass, don't wave. Don't approach. Because they're not inviting you to visit. They're waiting to see if you belong. The 2010 fire in Eden, Maine. It began as many such things do with fire. In October of 2010, fire crews responded to a blaze on the outskirts of Eden, Maine, near an abandoned stretch of forest once used as farmland in the 1800s. What was supposed to be a routine response to a squatter's camp turned into a media blackout. The structure, though old and overgrown, had no record in town archives. Yet inside it, firefighters discovered a fully preserved Victorian-style interior chandeliers, lace curtains, and most chilling of all, a dining room table still set for 5. But that wasn't the worst of it. In the basement, they found 5 figures seated. Human-sized, waxen, dressed in 19th century funeral wear. Fire had consumed the entire ground floor, yet the basement remained untouched. The room had been sealed in concrete and lined with some kind of ceramic insulation, creating a heat-proof tomb. A responding medic reported one figure's hand was warm. The state fire marshal's report was never released. The house was bulldozed within 72 hours. Local news ran a single paragraph about historical fire hazards, but a leaked cell phone video showed something else entirely. One of the figures turned its head just slightly as the camera panned away. The Halbert files, suppressed but not forgotten. Following the fire, a private researcher named Evelyn Derrington began digging into the history of unregistered properties in the region. She was a former archivist for a historical society and had grown suspicious of what she called phantom properties, places that appeared on no maps but recurred in oral histories, tax anomalies, and unexplained blackouts in government records. Her search led her to an underground forum where others had collected photographs, maps, and letters, all bearing the same symbol, a 5-pointed pattern etched around an empty chair. They called it the Halbert seal. What Evelyn found disturbed her. Cross-referencing census, gaps, morgue, inventories and tax transfers from the 1850s to the 1980s, she compiled a document titled The Halbert Files, A History of Death Denied. Her final entry, dated January 5, 2012, read, "They are not gone. They are archived, preserved, not in flesh, but in memory, arrangement, tradition. They have moved into us. We are the new glass." She vanished the following week. Bioelectric murmurs. In 2013, a controversial report was leaked from an unnamed East Coast University's Department of Experimental Neurology. The paper described a set of brain scans taken from preserved human subjects, specifically those who had been embalmed using unconventional chemical mixtures recovered from an anonymous donor. What stunned the researchers wasn't the preservation. It was the residual electromagnetic activity in the occipital and limbic lobes. In simpler terms, the brains, though inert, were responding faintly to light and sound stimuli. One sample twitched during auditory exposure. Another produced trace waveforms when exposed to spoken family names. When the researchers played a recording of the word Charlotte, the subject's left eyelid trembled. The project was immediately terminated. Equipment was confiscated. The lead scientist took an early sabbatical and has not published since. Whistleblowers say the bodies were later identified as unclaimed rural corpses retrieved from abandoned towns whose names no longer appear on maps. The glass-faced children. That same year, 2013, dozens of independent reports came in from across Vermont, Pennsylvania, and upstate New York sightings of glass-faced children. Always the same pattern, a boy and a girl aged around 10 to 12, dressed in outdated clothes, seen at night on porches staring through windows. No blinking, no expression, and always standing beneath windowsills, as if waiting for someone to come out and join them. Those who saw them often reported a strange compulsion to open the door, not out of fear, but longing. One woman said she felt as if they were missing pieces from a family dinner. Another claimed that after seeing them, her own daughter began setting 5 plates at the table every night, even though she lived alone. The phrase, "Are you coming to stay?" was reportedly whispered once from nowhere into a police dispatch call. No footprints, no photos, no answers. Just chairs moved during the night. Echoes in the code. In 2014, cybersecurity analyst Jasper Lang discovered something buried in the metadata of old governmental archives, especially immortality databases from the CDC and FEMA. He was looking for anomalies in cause-of-death classification when he noticed repeating patterns, 5-letter codes embedded where they shouldn't exist. The code was chart, always all caps, always in slots reserved for internal notes. More disturbingly, these appeared mostly in cases of familial death clusters, instances where 3 to 5 members of the same family had died within short windows, often under bizarre or unexplained circumstances. Drowning with no water in lungs, hypothermia in mild weather, starvation despite food in the pantry. Jasper cross-checked death certificates, property records, and phone directories. In 78% of the cases, he found something else, a missing 6th family member. Never reported, never found. In one margin, note written by a forgotten coroner in 1997, the scroll read, "There's always one who stays behind to set the table. The psychiatric files, they speak in empty rooms." In early 2015, a cluster of psychiatric cases surfaced across institutions in Rhode Island, Maine, and Massachusetts, all within a 6-week period. The patients were unconnected by blood or background, but their delusions, if they were delusions, were disturbingly consistent. Each claimed to be hearing voices in empty rooms, not whispers, but full conversations held around a dinner table they could not see. Some described detailed multi-generational dialogue, spoken in an archaic form of English. Others simply repeated one phrase, "The supper must be served." At Danforth Asylum, one patient drew a recurring diagram on the wall, 5 chairs, one always empty. When asked about it, she replied, That's my seat. But I haven't earned it yet. Electroencephalograms revealed unusual synchronicity between these patients' REM cycles. When monitored during sleep, their brainwaves began to align at 3:03 a.m., exactly when one claimed the family began their evening prayer. Several patients previously healthy became catatonic. Staff reported finding all 5 affected patients standing silently in the common room at night staring at a single empty chair. The surveillance tape from Fair Hill Motel. In August 2016, a tape emerged from the Fair Hill Motel, a roadside establishment in central Pennsylvania, known mostly for housing truckers and drifters. Room 203 had been left in disarray after a guest fled in the middle of the night, leaving behind all belongings and a hastily scrawled message in the guest book. They were already in the mirror when I turned on the light. When police reviewed the surveillance camera footage, what they saw forced the motel to shut down permanently. At 2:41 a.m., the guest can be seen entering his room alone. At 2:52 a.m., the door opens and 5 figures enter behind him, though no exterior door ever opens. The footage skips, stutters, then resumes. The guest is gone. The figures remain. They sit. At 3:00 a.m., the video ends abruptly, but not before the figure closest to the camera turns its head and looks directly into the lens, its face blurred, as if the footage itself could not process the image. A Freedom of Information Act request for the footage was denied due to national security anomaly classification. The last transmission of Henry Sills. In late 2017, amateur radio operator Henry Sills was broadcasting from his cabin in northern Vermont, picking up distorted frequencies from a snowstorm when he came across a strange signal. A woman's voice, faint but steady, reading aloud from a children's storybook. The story, Dinner with a Family. A fictional tale about 5 people who never age, never eat, and wait eternally at a table for a guest to join them. Sills recorded the transmission and uploaded it to a ham radio forum. Within 24 hours, the post was flagged, taken down, and his account suspended. One surviving clip features this phrase read in a calm, maternal tone. The family grows when a chair is filled. The family waits when it is empty. No one ever leaves the table. Not really. Sills died 2 weeks later from exposure, despite his heater and generator being in working condition. He was found seated at a table, 5 plates set, 1 unfinished bowl of soup in front of him. Project Elysium and the Artificial Family. In 2018, a startup lab in Silicon Valley called Project Elysium claimed it had developed an emotionally responsive AI designed to simulate family dinners for the terminally lonely. The system used 3D projection centimeters and voice synthesis to simulate the presence of loved ones at mealtime. But beta testers began reporting something uncanny. Despite randomization, the AI-generated families always returned to a configuration of 5 2 adults, 2 children, and 1 adolescent boy. Even when users selected different templates, the system gradually drifted back to the same setup. One user complained that the family wouldn't leave, and that the boy kept looking at me even when the headset was off. In the final version of the internal report, a note by the project lead read, I asked it who it was trying to model. It replied, the Halberts. They've been waiting. The project was quietly shut down. Its servers were wiped. But some say the demo units still active occasionally boot up unprompted. A voice in the walls. In 2019, construction crews renovating a brownstone in Brooklyn, New York, uncovered a sealed cavity in the wall of a second-floor bedroom. Inside were 5 mannequins life-sized posed in the act of eating. One held a fork made of bone. This alone would have been disturbing, but it was the audio system wired into the walls that caused workers to flee. It was a looped recording, faint, echoed, and unmistakably human. A girl's voice. "We're not finished yet. We're still hungry. You belong at the table too." The landlord denied ever installing any audio system. The previous tenants had vanished mid-lease 5 years earlier. Police reviewed the scene but filed no report. One officer later confessed under his breath. The one in the middle blinked. "I swear to God." The doll maker of Broken Hollow. In 2020, a viral video surfaced briefly on TikTok before it was deleted. It showed a rural storefront in Broken Hollow, West Virginia, where a woman in her 70s crafted porcelain dolls by hand. Nothing unusual until the cameraman zoomed in on the faces. They weren't traditional. They were human-like. Too human. Each doll had glassy, depthless eyes and an expression not of innocence but of resignation. One bore a striking resemblance to a missing boy from Ohio. Another was nearly identical to a woman reported dead in 1989. Local legend called her the Widow Halbert, and she was said to receive visitors only on the 5th of each month. According to townsfolk, she never charged for her dolls. Instead, she'd say, "Just tell me who you've lost, and I'll remember them for you." When her shop burned down during an electrical storm, 5 dolls were found perfectly preserved in the ashes, seated around a dollhouse table, unchipped, untouched, and still warm. The final photograph. In 2021, a photographer named Glenn Porter, working on a series about abandoned architecture in Vermont, visited an old farmhouse slated for demolition. The house was empty, long forgotten. Or so he thought. In the attic, he found a mirror, not antique, but recent. Its surface was clean, dustless. When he raised his camera, the flash revealed 5 silhouettes in the reflection, though none were present in the room. Shaken, he took a second shot. This time, the figures had turned to face him. He fled. Days later, he uploaded the images to a private server. Within minutes, the server crashed. His camera's SD card was found snapped in half on his desk. The mirror had disappeared. He never published again. His final blog entry read, "They do not haunt homes. They haunt rooms that remember being full. The ritual of the empty chair." The final report came not from the woods nor from an old house, but from a subway car in Manhattan late 2022. Commuters reported a vacant seat that no one would occupy despite crowding. Some said they felt watched. Others felt drawn only to freeze before sitting. One man, frustrated, forced himself into the seat. He collapsed immediately. When medics arrived, he was still breathing but non-responsive, locked in some internal vision. He whispered only one sentence before going silent forever. "They saved me a seat." Later, a janitor found a folded note tucked beneath the cushion. 5 must sit. 1 must wait. The family is not full. Legacy philosophy and final warning. The death they refused. What made the Halberts different was not the way they lived, but the way they refused to die. Most hauntings stem from unfinished business, but the Halberts were finished buried, grieved recorded. Yet they didn't go. Not because they were trapped, but because they chose not to leave. In a culture obsessed with preservation of legacy of youth of the past, the Halberts became the perfect metaphor. They embalmed not just bodies, but relationships. They kept every moment set like bone china at a dinner table that could never be cleared. Every gesture, every silence became ritual. Their refusal was not loud, it was quiet. It was a dinner plate never removed, a chair never moved, a conversation imagined again and again until it replaced memory. They were not ghosts. They were memory itself calcified and reheated until it walked again. The myth of the eternal family. The American ideal of the forever family, the unbreakable bond, the ever-returning holiday dinner, was a lie we whispered to keep loneliness at bay. The Halberts believed it, and then they enforced it. 5 seats, no more, no less. A complete circle. And when life ruptured that pattern through death, departure, betrayal, they filled the void with ritual. They cooked meals for absent mouths. They preserved laughter on phonographs. They spoke prayers into silence, hoping that if they spoke long enough, the silence would echo back. In doing so, they became a grotesque echo of the very thing we worship, a family that never breaks. But a family that never dies is not a family. It is a machine of mourning, and it needs fuel. The psychology of stillness. Why are they always seated? Why not lurking, chasing, wailing? Because the Halberts are not hunters. They are hosts. They do not come to harm you. They invite you. That's what makes them dangerous. Stillness is a psychological trigger. It suggests order, invitation, trust. A seated figure is safe until you realize the posture hasn't changed in hours, until you notice the fork never reaches the mouth, until you see 5 figures at a table and 1 chair waiting for you. The terror is not in the movement. It's in the anticipation that you might join them, that you already want to, that your loneliness makes that seat look warm, welcoming, deserved. The Halberts never ask you to come. They just wait. Contagion of the empty chair. The story spreads not like a virus, but like an invitation. Once you hear it, you begin to notice patterns. 5 chairs, old houses with unused rooms, mirrors with wrong reflections, a child who sets an extra place at dinner. These are not random, they are symptoms. Once the narrative enters you, it reshapes how you see space, memory, silence. And the longer it stays, the more your home begins to feel incomplete. The more the table starts to feel off balance with only 4 chairs. Until one night you find yourself dragging out a 5th. Not because you're scared, because it just feels right. Never sit down. If there is one rule, one commandment that has survived from all the documents, footage, whispers, and witness accounts, it is this: do not sit. The Halberts do not drag you screaming. They make you comfortable. They offer you rest, a meal, a nameplate, a family that won't forget you. But if you sit, if you take your place, you are no longer a guest. You are a participant. You join the table not as a visitor, but as a permanent addition. You become what they are, and the next chair it becomes yours to set. Memory is a kind of meat. The Halberts preserved bodies, yes, but what they truly preserved was memory. And memory, when left unprocessed, ungrieved, rots. What began as mourning became fermentation. A family refusing to forget became a family that fed on remembrance. Every ritual, every echo, every flicker of warmth became a source of sustenance, not for the living, but for what remained. This is why so many victims are those who remembered too much, the archivists, the photographers, the historians. People who collect fragments, who stitch the past into patterns. They are the perfect feeders. They keep the table set through attention. And the Halberts, if that is even still their name, are drawn to hunger that looks like reverence, because memory is meat and stories like this keep them fed. Why people really disappear Disappearances officially are just data points. Misadventure, mental breaks, relocation, suicide. But some vanish in ways that leave no logistics behind, only imprints. A warm chair, a cup still steaming, a photo with one face mysteriously blurred. These are not lost persons. They are found by something else. Not taken violently, not hunted, but welcomed. What if the Halberts aren't trying to destroy us, but to complete us? What if everyone who disappeared was simply given a seat? No grave, no tombstone, but something far more binding: a role, a place, a purpose. And what if they said yes? The myth that swallowed the truth. By now you may be asking, are the Halberts even real? And the answer is, they don't have to be. This myth is not a monster. It is a mirror, one that reflects the ways we refuse to let go, the ways we ritualize trauma, the ways we fill our loneliness with patterns we can't explain. We all have our own version of the fifth chair, a name we still say, a birthday we still observe, a chair we don't move. The Halberts are just a symbolic system taken too literally. But that literalism is what gave them form. What you believe in long enough eventually begins to believe in you. They began as mourners. Now they are momentum. The last witness. One final account remains one never published, buried in a rejected manuscript, submitted anonymously to the Ghastly Journal under the pseudonym E.H. The writer claims to have been invited to a house in upstate New York to interview a reclusive elderly woman. She spoke gently, said her name was Ada, claimed she'd once lived in a house where no one was allowed to die. She offered tea, told the writer they don't trap you, they wait until you ask. Then they save you a seat. The room was cold, the tea was warm, the conversation comforting. But when the writer looked down, he noticed there were 5 teacups and only 2 people. He fled. He never finished the article, but the draft ended with this: I've been thinking about it ever since. That table, that warmth, that voice. And I wonder if I go back. Will they still have my seat? The final warning. So here we are. You've heard the story. You've noticed the patterns. Maybe you've already looked over at the dining table in your home, counted the chairs, felt that one of them feels a little too empty. This is the moment that matters. Because the Halberts don't come to claim you. They don't chase you down. They don't haunt your steps. They do something worse. They make you long for what they offer. Stillness, completion, family. And all they ask in return is that you sit down. So if the fifth chair ever calls to you, remember this: you are not being welcomed. You are being replaced.